Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
This magnificent feast here represents the last of the petty cash.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Auten. I'm joined by Chad Gross, and we're excited to have a couple of guests with us today, Wintery Knight and Desert Rose. We'll go to them in just a moment, but I want to thank everybody who's been taking part in our podcast survey. In the show notes, you can check out the link to that survey. We'll be giving away a book or two to those who take part. We really appreciate that, and we just want to say thanks. A lot of good, interesting insights and ideas for the future, so thank you for that. Chad, are you looking forward to this interview today?
Yes, it's always fun to talk to Wintery Knight and kind of soak up some of his passion for apologetics and defending the faith. And of course, I have not had the pleasure of meeting Desert Rose yet, his podcast mate, if you will. And so I am looking forward to chatting with both of them.
All right, let's get right to it.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Knight and Rose, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
For our listeners, we have with us Wintery Knight and Desert Rose. Tell us a little bit about what's been happening with you since our last interview with you and what's going on with this podcast.
So probably the most significant thing, I don't know if I was a citizen last time I spoke to you guys, but I am now.
Yeah.
Yay.
Excellent. Congratulations.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Looking forward to voting in my first election. So the blog is still going strong. I still put out one post a day and just a mix of apologetics and politics. And in addition to that, Rose and I have started this podcast where we've been talking about some of the similar things that I write about. So that's pretty much everything that's going on here.
Super. Desert Rose. People are wondering, who is this and what is this name? So that's on you to explain yourself a little bit, maybe whatever sort of background you want to reveal and what your background is with apologetics as well.
Sure. Yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up playing competitive tennis and going to school, and that's about it. That was all really that I did. I didn't have a typical childhood. I didn't have really much of a social life. I was training to be a professional tennis player. It was really hard at times, of course, to be training and to be so disciplined in every area of life, from what I ate to how I spent every second of my time. But, looking back on it, it was really, really good for me. Instead of having kind of a typical, comfortable, I guess, childhood that Americans tend to have, where kids are today at least told, everything they do is absolutely wonderful and they just need to be comfortable and make themselves happy and love themselves and all of those things that feel good. I was always being told how I could be better and what I needed to do to be better and to win and to achieve my goals. I was told often that is not good enough. That's not going to work. You need to do this instead. And one of my coaches, I remember when I was 10 years old, one of my coaches said, "We don't have any time for mediocre here. Okay, so if you're going to do mediocre, go home, get your mind right, and come back tomorrow." And I remember asking him, what is that word you said, mediocre? And he goes, "It means half-assed, and we don't do that here." And it sounds really, really harsh, but I really credit those my tennis coaches for equipping me and building me up into the person I am today. I did see amazing results. I was told all the way up until I started having some serious health problems that I could be the best tennis player in the world. And even though I did not end up continuing tennis because of those health issues, I think a lot of those habits have made me who I am today. That hard work ethic and that always wanting to be better and going to reliable people who know what they're talking about on specific issues and learning from them and trying to incorporate those in my life and fighting for what I believe in, doing the hard work to get things done, loving achievements, loving to be better and to learn and grow. I think that's an important part of my background. I don't play tennis anymore, but I am a CrossFit athlete and now a podcaster, and those types of things have really served me well in the different areas that I'm involved in. I think that's something that WK and I have in common.
Cool.
Yeah, I was just curious as to how you guys met and decided to start working together.
This started because there was an article that Rose had written for, I think it was Gospel Discipleship Daily or something. Or
It was gospel-centered discipleship, yeah.
Right, that's it. And I saw this article, and the topic of this article was why I gave up writing testimonies in order to talk about evidence. And I linked to that article on my blog, and I contacted the author and I said, what caused you to do this, and tell me more? Because I was just about had it, with the testimony sharing, which I thought was very ineffective, and really wanted to know more about who this person was. So we hit it off from there, and we've been friends ever since. And we just seem to agree so much about everything, not just apologetics, but also policy. Rose, you have a background with public policy, right?
Yes. Yeah. I studied public policy in school, and I worked as a lobbyist for a conservative Christian organization in DC, and absolutely loved that. And ever since then, I've continued to have a passion for policy and seen how it really makes a real world difference. So that was something that we really connected on. Most of my friends at the time that WK contacted me were saying, don't mention policy for any reason, or at least don't make it sound like it's important, because that's a distraction from the gospel, and that's going to turn people off. And so just forget the policy thing. If you want to do evangelism and apologetics, you need to leave behind the policy issues. And that's not something I was willing to do.
Yeah, we both have this interest in authenticity and a comprehensive worldview that touches on everything. And I think Rose is basically like not interested in getting the good opinion of anybody. And she always says what she thinks. And I think similarly, I saw her talking like this and being controversial in her writings and in her speaking. And I just thought, I should probably make friends with this person, because I think it would be wonderful if more Christians kind of adopted her point of view and started to be super authentic and evidence-based as well, since that's what works.
I think that anyone listening to your podcast, which is the Knight and Rose Show, which we'll link to, go subscribe right now, we'll find that there is a real commonality between your interests, both passionate about the things you talk about. You mentioned policy, the realm of apologetics, and mentoring others and discipleship, and how to integrate the Christian worldview into every aspect of your life. So can you talk a bit about some of the things you've been touching on in the podcast so people who haven't listened yet can get a taste of the different topics?
I'm really excited about the 3-part series on the church that we recorded. And we talk a lot about what the state of the church is, what's going on there, why are people walking away from the church in such large numbers? Why is it that the percentage of people who call themselves Christians is so low when it comes to how many of those have a Christian worldview and not just, say they're Christians? And we talk a lot about what is a better way forward. That's something that we're both passionate about. We love the church. We are part of the body of Christ. We want to see Christ's body thrive, and that's just not what we're seeing. And so we talk a lot about how we see a better way forward.
Yeah. So picking up on that, I think our first show was the Easter show, where we talked about the minimal facts argument for the resurrection of Jesus. And basically there we were trying to make it easy for someone who is just not used to apologetics to be able to have a fun and engaging conversation with a non-Christian. And the way we did that was we actually quoted a lot of non-Christians who write about the historical Jesus, just showing people what they can and can't use, and giving them some comfort with talking about their Christian worldview and Christian truth claims in connection with history, so that instead of discussing their faith, they were really discussing their facts. So that was episode 1. And then in episode 2, we talked about the importance of using evidence. And I think what Rose and I bring to the table is she has a ton of conversations in her neighborhood, in addition to her speaking, podcasting, and so on. So she just has a lot of adventures and experience, and I try to do the same thing the best I can in the workplace. So what we're trying to do is kind of break down how to get into those conversations and how to be comfortable and defensible in what you're discussing. And so we did the 3-part series on church, and the next 2 that we have planned, we're going to be talking about masculinity for single men and in marriage, which is something we're not real thrilled with the way that Christian culture understands male and female roles and relationships. And so we feel that it's too much like the secular world, and there isn't much room for focusing on God. So what we do is we try to talk about that from the perspective of Christianity and see if we can give people some pointers for how to, particularly for men, what they can be doing to be engaging their distinct male nature as Christians and getting results with that.
Yeah, I'm really excited about that series as well. Actually, we have already recorded those. I'm excited for them to come out. I've read a lot of comments on WK's blog over the years from men who follow him and who are conservative and who have a lot of great things that they're involved in, but who make comments like, well, women shouldn't read books. Well, women shouldn't be involved in partnering with their husbands for ministry. Well, you're never going to find a woman who can do that. And why would you want her to anyway? Her job is to just make me my food and bring me my slippers. That's her job. And so some will say, women don't know how, like they imply, women don't know how to be effective in anything kingdom centered. And others will say, maybe they could be if someone were to coach them, but that's just not where we're at today. And in the former case, I find that really degrading. In the latter case of just, I can't find a good woman like that. I feel for the men. It breaks my heart because I do see that the church is not producing women who are generally well-read, excited to be involved in ministry. If you look at the top 100 best-selling books of last year, I mean, it's there are like 3 apologetics books on there and just a whole bunch of watered-down garbage. Self-help books, exactly. And so we wanted to talk to both issues. What can the church be doing to better equip people? And what could a relationship that is kingdom focused look like, and how can we get there? So those are both topics that I think we have a lot to add.
That sounds great. So, Rose, one of the things that I found fascinating, and I think it was on podcast 3, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, was you told a story about a young lady that you were mentoring, and you began mentoring this young lady, and you gave her some things to read so that you can meet and talk to her about them. And what began happening, and listeners, you need to go listen to the podcast if you want to hear the whole story. I'm just giving the outline. Is that what began happening is when you would meet with her, she just wasn't doing what you were asking her to do. It was kind of a one-sided mentorship, if you will. And she said something along the lines of, well, I'd really like to be like you. I'd like to understand what I believe, be able to articulate it, but I don't really want to do all the work.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I find that WK, you've been writing about this on your blog for years. That's kind of a prevailing attitude, unfortunately, in the church with a lot of people is, yes, I'd like to be able to defend the faith, but man, it's a lot of work, or, oh, I'm very busy, or whatnot. And so I guess I want to ask, how do you guys think, what would be a great way to encourage people or help people see the need and kind of shake them out of their apathy of needing to equip themselves and being able to defend the faith?
So what we do on the podcast is the first thing you have to know about Rose is that she's extremely well-read, and whatever you can imagine in terms of evidential apologetics or theology, she has a seminary degree, and maybe she can talk a little bit about that. So she's reading the same kind of books that I'm used to: Thomas Sowell for economics, Stephen Meyer for science apologetics, Mike Licona and Gary Habermas for, resurrection. So she's extremely well read. But what we do on the podcast in order to bridge that gap is we kind of talk about our conversations. We talk about conversations in the workplace and the neighborhood and try to show people how having the data at hand equips you to be able to have these conversations. So I talk about in a recent episode, today's episode, I talk about whiteboard diagramming, chaining amino acids into proteins and explaining the probability calculations to my coworkers. And you could learn how to do that really quickly by just picking up a Stephen Meyer book and familiarizing yourself with this with a little basic probability. You can have that adventure. And so just showing, what we can do. Rose actually had a really good story about someone she used to work with for that resurrection episode, I think it was.
Yeah, I think, in sharing our experiences, I think one of our hopes is that people will see how much fun we have, how when we read and learn something and then we're able to go out and utilize it in conversations with friends, and it gives us confidence, it gives us effectiveness, it gives us honestly a really great time. It is so fun to go out. Before I studied apologetics, I really just kind of wanted to talk only to Christians because I didn't know how to handle it if people would disagree with me. Once I started really learning apologetics, which started in seminary, I found that it was so much fun to start having conversations with non-Christians. Now I love talking to non-Christians. I seek them out. I often end up disappearing for CrossFit for like 2.5 hours, even though it's an hour-long workout, because I end up staying after and talking to people about gospel-type topics, about science, philosophy, and history as it relates to the gospel. I think that when people see the difference it can make in their practical lives and in their ability to live out the Great Commission and their ability to impact people and their ability to demonstrate that this idea that Christians are anti-intellectual and anti-science and, fools and all of this does not need to be believed, that you don't have to be anti-intellectual to be a Christian. In fact, the evidence is strongly on our side in a lot of ways. And so there's one story I share about a conversation I have with a neighbor. I have a neighbor who originally told me when we first met that he could never take Christianity seriously because he's into science. He thinks science is a serious topic. So he could never be a Christian. He believed that, being an adult and a Christian was about as silly as being an adult and believing in Santa Claus or the flying spaghetti monster. He just thought that was ridiculous. And so I told him, I actually am a Christian in part because of the science. And I'd love to talk to you about science sometime. And so we've had a couple of dozen conversations over the last couple of years about science. And I guess it was about 6 months ago that he said that Christianity actually does offer, a reasonable explanation for the evidence. And then just a couple of weeks ago, he said that Christianity offers the best explanation for the evidence, which is just remarkable. I mean, this guy studies cosmology and astronomy all day, every day. That's what he does. And now he is saying, this is the best explanation out there, is what you find in Genesis 1. So we're having fun. We're making a difference. Yeah.
I think if you cash out Christian evangelism as sharing your feelings, that would be like someone who's like a Hindu or a Muslim talking about avatars and riding horses in the sky and stuff like that. But that's not what we do here. What we do is we talk about mainstream evidence and mainstream discovery. So Rose is talking to somebody who works. Where does that guy work again? Like in some kind of planetarium or something?
Yeah, he works at a planetarium children's museum.
So when she talks, she's going to talk about the origin of the universe, and she's going to talk about the history of making discoveries related to the origin of the universe. So she's going to talk about Edwin Hubble discovers the redshift, by analyzing distant stars. And then we make the discovery of the cosmic microwave background radiation. And then we make the discovery of light element abundances and nucleosynthesis and so on. So he knows all this. So she's talking about things that he knows because that's his profession. And so when she's talking about these things, she has confidence because she's talking about things that non-Christians know and accept. And that's why it's a completely different conversation than, when I was young, I prayed and God helped me find my baseball bat that was missing. This is not what we're doing. And when you get that validation the first time from somebody who's an expert in the field, you get really interested in learning about this stuff and having these conversations. I hope I explained that well enough that people sort of understand. We are not dealing in the Christian world here. We are not dealing in what you learn in church. When we're talking about things like the origin of life and the fine tuning or even the minimal facts case for the resurrection, we're dealing with evidence. And so there's no need to be scared about having conversations about this. This is stuff that's accessible to your audience.
Yeah. The thing that I like to hear is, number one, the stories of how you've been doing it for yourselves. And then also, I appreciate you guys' passion and your mindset. And I wonder, Wintery Knight, if you could talk a bit about sort of a metaphor you use about pleasing the boss. Focus on results for the boss. Because things like that are essential keys and helpful, maybe mental shifts that will help the listener.
Right. Yeah, this is the cornerstone of our podcast and our friendship as well. Most people, when they, even if they meet people in church or they make friends, they're kind of thinking about relationships and teaming up as something that's going to make them happy. So maybe it will make them feel good, or maybe we see the other person as a kind of commodity, or we see being popular as a goal that's beneficial for us, and maybe being socially accepted, is something that's a priority for us. But that is not how Rose and I look at the Christian life. We are very successful and dependable and defensible people. Like we're not in a crisis. We're not in suffering. We've made good decisions in our lives, and we're dealing with Christianity from a position of strength. And so when we look at God, we don't look at God as our cosmic butler. We are not trying to get things from him, and we don't think that he's trying to make us happy. Our perspective is that he has a certain character, and there are people having conversations about him and making decisions about whether he exists, what he's like out there in the world. And we want to be involved in representing the fact that he exists and what his character is like to those people. And so I talk about this in the Church Fixes episode part 1, where I talk about Rifleman Dodd. And this is a British rifleman who serves under Wellington, who's cut off from the rest of his troops, and he has to be alone behind enemy lines. And he doesn't have contact with his supervising officer anymore. And so what he does is he tries to remember what he remembers about the character of his commanding officer, what he remembers about the strategies and the overall goals of his army. And he takes independent action in order to achieve things for his commander. And he's reunited with his army. But I think that perspective shows what Rose and I think about Christianity as being. We're basically not looking for God to do for us, but we try to understand who he is, and then we look to see where we can make decisions that keep faith with him and that achieve his priorities.
Yeah, I see this cosmic butler idea that WK. I love that phrase that he uses. This seems to be the more common view of God throughout the church. I see this all over the place. I hear. I've worked in ministries where I've heard dozens, if not hundreds, of testimonies, and what people talk about so frequently in their testimonies as things like, when I was in high school and I hadn't studied for a test, and I prayed that God would help me, and somehow I passed the test anyway. So now I'm a Christian, and this kind of, God exists to give me what I want. God exists to get me my high school diploma, or my girlfriend, the girl that I want, or my bachelor's degree. And, having heard these testimonies years ago, all of those types of testimonies, when I used to listen to those, it was years ago. I can tell you that a large number of those people don't follow Jesus anymore. Those were people who were in ministry because they were excited about God at the time. And you ask them why they're excited. It's because he gave them what they wanted. And then life happens and you don't always get what you want. And so a lot of these people just walked away, may call themselves progressive Christians, but they don't affirm the resurrection or things that are central to the gospel. Or they may be atheists now. Some of them, one in particular is practicing paganism. And so, these are people who were in the church for years. These were people who were in ministry for years and wanting to give of themselves to something they believed in until they didn't believe it anymore because, the reason for getting into it was no longer the case anymore. So we want to give people a realistic and biblical understanding of God and of a full Christian worldview, and communicate the message among others that you're not always going to get what you want, but you get to be a part of the mission of God. Like, what an incredibly cool thing to be a part of. I don't deserve that, to get to be a part of what the King of Kings is doing on his earth with, among people. What an incredible thing. And we have a really significant mission that's an incredible honor and privilege to be a part of. And we want people to get on board with that and to see how awesome it can be.
Yeah, one of the things you both talk about on the podcast is this idea of people leaving the church for various reasons and dwindling numbers and things like that. Would you say that part of the reason that's happening is because the church in many ways is giving people a false view of what Christianity is, and then when their expectations aren't met, that they walk away because they didn't understand that it was a life of service and many times difficulty, but that they unfortunately came to it because they were told that God has a wonderful plan for your life?
That's exactly what the problem is.
Yes.
Yeah.
What would be the best way to combat that? So if a pastor's listening right now and he's kind of recognizing, like, wow, I'm really liking a lot of what I'm hearing. I would like my parishioners to have more evidentially based beliefs, to be able to, I'd like to be able to equip them. What should he start with?
Yeah, well, one thing we talk a lot about in one of the church episodes is the importance of discipleship, and how, Jesus took 12 men and lived life with them day and night for 3 years. And, this wasn't just, come and listen to me give a talk for a little while and then go do the rest of your life, the rest of the week with whomever, however you want. There was a very intentional pouring into them in every aspect of their lives. And that's something that we haven't seen a whole lot of in the church. And I think that, I know that pastors have very limited time, but so I think if pastors were intentionally discipling, a dozen or so men to, with the expectation that they would soon start to disciple a dozen or so men themselves, and then that would carry on, that would go a long, long way.
Neither Rose nor I grew up in the church, and at least in terms of my experience, what I see when I go there is I see one person standing at the top of the stage and delivering a sermon that no one can question, and the Bible is assumed to be inerrant, and there's no forming up of teams. So when I see that, what I see is it's similar to kind of an entertainment experience. In the sense that nothing is expected in terms of teaming up and achieving results. So in contrast with that, think of something like Brett Kunkle and his group Maven. So what they do is they train young people to go to different areas, like to talk to the Mormons in Utah or talk to the college students in Berkeley. And so his approach is completely different. They're training young people in a team for a task. They know the test is coming. And so that's a completely different view of Christianity that resonates with me. I think the Bible is very supportive of the idea that it is normal, and this is really important. People who identify as Christian need to understand that being not accepted by non-Christians is a normal part of the Christian life, that you cannot change your point of view in order to appeal to everyone and make everyone like you. You cannot take on their priorities. Their priorities are not your priorities. And it's a normal and natural part of the Christian life to feel bad and to be rejected. So I think those two things together, number one, teaming up for the gospel in the way that Philippians describes, forming, fellowship over gospel missions. So like one person is a college student and wants to bring in a speaker, and someone else pays the bill to bring the speaker or pay for the recording or pay for the security. That needs to be the normal, not somebody delivering a sermon and then you go home. And then the second thing is we need to set expectations that the normal Christian life is the life of a soldier. That there's nobody coming to save you. You shouldn't depend on it. What you should be doing is thinking about, how do I work for the benefit of my commanding officer in this army, rather than how does my commanding officer work for me? I know that's very different from what most people want to hear, but I think that that's probably more along the lines of the normal Christian life than what most people learn from church.
Well said. I'm
also a firm believer that what you win people with is what you win them to. And so if you win them with free coffee and sappy feelings-oriented, me-centered music and social activities and sermons that don't equip people for excellence, you haven't won them to Christ. You've won them to those things that I just mentioned. You've won them to worldly things. They can get better coffee someplace else. They can get better music someplace else. And maybe they make their friends there and they keep coming for their friends. But then when the culture starts to change, so do their convictions. And so I really think we need to equip people. And like Jesus did, Jesus called people to count the cost up front. He often called people to leave behind the things that were the most important to them right up front. He didn't, entertain them for a few years and say, maybe now we should go, 1 inch deeper. And then, in that sort of approach, he said, look, this is going to be hard. It's like the life of a soldier. You're going to, there's going to be suffering involved. There's going to be sacrifice involved. You want to come or not? And of course, he didn't force anybody to go. He let people go away from them, which I think is another thing we haven't been willing enough to do. Just let people leave if they don't want Christ and if they don't want to be a part of the mission. We don't need to chase them and water things down and try to win them back into the building so that we can get maybe bigger numbers or whatever. I don't know what the goal of that is. I do think that the goal is probably that they'll hear some truth at some point down the road and commit their lives to Christ. And sometimes that does happen, but I don't think that we give people a realistic expectation for what the Christian life is about. And so now I think we're seeing, as the culture is changing pretty quickly, we're seeing that within the church, a lot of people are just saying, oh yeah, now this isn't really what I had in mind, and I don't really want to be a part of this anymore.
In a couple of your episodes, you talk about masculinity and what biblical masculinity looks like. And as you're talking there about maybe combating a sort of seeker-sensitive approach by emphasizing a life of discipleship, and there is difficulty and there is this soldier's mentality to the life of a disciple. It would seem to me that what men seem to be drawn to is like, hey, I want a challenge. I want to do something difficult and hard. And do you think it would be the case that, there's a lack of masculinity in the church because men are not being challenged to step up?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I notice in the church is that, in particular for men, there isn't any vision for them in terms of gaining strength that is a uniquely Christian perspective on being stronger. And so in my particular case, what I do is I talk about the need to focus on your education, career, and finances so that you have disposable income to partner up with the people around you. And this is not weird. This is straight out of Philippians. Read Philippians 1, 2, and 4. I think that encouraging men to be excellent in their educations and careers and finances, to deliver first-class work, and to be looking around at people around them that they can partner up with in order to achieve things for God, that would probably be the first thing I would think of is just making stronger men. Men who are not dependent on others, men who are not focused on entertainment or OnlyFans or alcohol and drugs, but men who stand on their own 2 feet and they are looking at other people and saying, what are you planning to do? And if the plan is good, they can step in there and say, here's my contribution, and here are some people that I can put you in touch with. So I think that's what I would say is that we're not expecting much from men. Whatever it is that they're learning in movies and the culture, it isn't translating into them setting goals and reaching those goals and knowing what to do and taking threats against the Christianity seriously. Oh, I have to say one quick thing. So a lot of Christians I talk to who are young are horrified of the culture war. So they don't want to get involved with anything that's us versus them. So you see this with issues like abortion and same-sex marriage and even Black Lives Matter and CRT. I think that that's one thing is somehow men are absorbing this perspective from the church that conflict is bad, it's better to get along, and they just don't want the burden of having to fight. And so I think that that's probably one thing that I would try to work on.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I was actually going to mention that as well. And then just to add to that, men who are ready and willing to fight for truth and goodness and beauty are not likely to stick around most modern Western churches very long anyway, because the culture has become so much all about just being nice. No matter what's going on, you just be nice, you just get along, you just love everybody. And the word love has been hijacked by the culture as well. It doesn't mean tell people the truth and fight for goodness. It means affirm people in everything they do, make them feel good about themselves. I do think that there are men out there who would love to be a part of an awesome mission like what Jesus left us with in the Great Commission, who are looking at what is actually going on in Western Christianity and saying, no thanks. I'd rather sleep in. And then I think also there are a lot of men who are in the church who would love to be, who maybe go to church because it's expected of them for whatever reason, but who would be a lot more excited to be there if they were equipped for mission for the rest of their week, for the rest of their lives, for their conversations with coworkers and the types of things that we get to be involved in.
Yeah, let me say something about that. So we've been talking about having apologetics conversations in the neighborhood and in the workplace. So if you're going to take a stand on, say, okay, so abortion is in the news right now because the Supreme Court, there's been a leak and apparently there's a possibility that Roe v. Wade is going to be overturned. So let's take that from a Christian point of view and say, I think it's undeniable that Christians stand with the unborn. It's basically the rule, thou shalt not murder, coupled with the fact that the unborn is fully human, means that we have to say something and speak up about this. So in terms of masculinity, I think of things like moral and spiritual leadership. And so I expect men to be able to defend the unborn and have conversations about it when it's in the news, especially. So I think what makes a man bold in this area is an armed man is bold, a man with armor and a sword, metaphysically or metaphorically speaking. If a person goes through 20 years of church and they've never read a book by Scott Klusendorf about the pro-life arguments, pro-life apologetics, then they're unarmed. And so they're not going to be masculine in the sense of being a moral and spiritual leader on this issue. So I think that if you're asking what should the pastor do, you need to make soldiers. And the way that you do that is that you have a book study where you invite all the men and they all bring a copy of The Case for Life and they work through it chapter by chapter. And then they bring in maybe a challenger and have that person present, and then they ask questions, or they go somewhere and do sidewalk counseling or something like that. But I think that that's how you make better men, is you understand that there's no way you're going to get boldness and courage out of a man if he's unarmed. And that means he's got to train himself with books and debates and arguments to be persuasive.
And there's going to be a cost to that. You know, if a pastor who is leading a church that's not like that today, you know, decides to adopt that kind of philosophy next week, you know, there are probably going to be a lot of people complaining and whining and say, but just be nice. But what about Jesus? He was just nice. He never offended anyone. Which should be a clue right there that your congregation needs to open the Bible. But it's going to result in pushback. It's going to take courage. It's not going to be popular, but I do think it is the way forward when we're looking at a long-term perspective. So being faithful to the mission of God, like we've said, it does result in controversy, disagreements, people not approving of you.
You know, shifting gears a little bit, you guys have talked about the culture war. You've brought up some, hot button issues like abortion. And one thing I've noticed about your podcast, and of course, WK following your blog for years, is that you guys don't shy away from talking about politics and policy. Mm-hmm. And there are some Christians that would, push back against that and say that we shouldn't be involved in politics. And so I'm just curious as to why you guys believe that's important, and what would you say to that individual who thinks that we shouldn't be involved in policy and politics?
Our interest in policy and politics, at least I should say my interest in policy and politics, is not an interest in current events. It's not an interest in personalities. I have no interest in politicians' individual characters or what mean things they've tweeted or what they did in college. I couldn't care less. When I'm looking at policy and politics, what I'm looking at is I have a responsibility to God, a vertical responsibility that I'm expected to discharge. I need to live in an environment where I have the resources and the liberty that I need to do this. So we could think about this in two ways to begin. We could think about this in terms of personal liberty, freedom of, I'm not from this country, okay? And the reason I came here is because the place I left did not have freedom of speech. It did not have a Second Amendment, did not have a First Amendment. So the first thing is that I need to live in a country that respects the rights that I need in order to speak out about the things that I believe and not be held accountable. So in the previous 2020 election, there were two candidates. One of the candidates supported something called the Equality Act, which would have made it illegal to take a lot of the positions that I need to take as a Christian on sexual ethics. There was another law called the Women's Health Protection Act, which would have rolled back all state and local regulations on abortion. So these are the kinds of things that I'm interested in. What are the laws? The second thing is, in order to push my plan, I need to be able to team up with people around me who are like-minded and achieve results. So that could mean bringing a speaker to campus, funding an apologetics conference, handing an apologetics book to someone. All these things are better when you have money. And so naturally, I'm going to be interested in economic policy because it's related to me having a job, being able to find a job. Not everywhere has the entrepreneurship and job creation that allows me to have flexibility to change jobs if one job becomes too hot because of my conscience. You know, if I'm working for Google, or a company that has a record of going against software engineers who are a little bit too outspoken about certain issues, I need to find another job. I need to live in a place where jobs are available. And I need to be able to keep most of what I own so that when someone comes to me and says, I want to do this for the boss, I want to do that for the boss, I can say, here, and throw a pack of money at them. Or I can say to them, we have people who can help you with that. So I think that's my interest in politics and policy. It's nothing to do with the culture war, nothing to do with cults of personality or individual. I just want the policies.
Yeah, and I'll add to that being a disciple of Christ, as we've talked about, means having a comprehensive biblical worldview. It does not mean praying a prayer and then doing whatever you want to do, or withdrawing completely from society, or just, living however you want. God has something to say about everything. There's no topic really that is of any significance that is completely neutral, value neutral, that God has nothing to inform us about. And policies have enormous consequences for millions and millions of people. God cares about people. People are made in God's image. We're told to be salt and light to the world. And so if we're going to have a biblical worldview, and if we're going to be salt, if we're going to be light, we really need to be aware of what's going on in policy matters that impact God's image bearers. It was the early Christians who ultimately were the reason why abortion was outlawed, why infanticide was outlawed in early Rome, why the gladiator fights were outlawed, why the sick and dying ended up being treated instead of just tossed out into the streets. In more modern times, it's why slavery was outlawed. These are all policies that Christians were behind and that were changed because of Christian voices, Christians fighting for goodness and truth and beauty. And we have similar battles to fight in our day as well. And so we cannot just be content to pray a prayer and think that somehow God doesn't care about policies that impact millions of people.
Yeah, I got to say one quick thing. I think when we're thinking about policy, what Rose and I are thinking about is these are facts. So when you approach someone who's a non-Christian and they say, I don't believe in God, and you say, how did the universe begin? And they go, the universe began? And you go, yeah. And you explain how the universe began. And then they go, wow, I never knew that fact. I clearly have to reevaluate my beliefs in light of the facts that you've presented. So when we're talking about policy, we're not talking about our club, our Democrat club or our Republican club. We're talking about, if you raise the minimum wage, what is the effect that's known to happen in all times and places to the unskilled poor who are seeking their first job? And the answer is it raises unemployment, particularly for minorities. That's universal. That's not a contentious belief. So when we're taking positions on policies, whatever the policy is, even on abortion and same-sex issues or anything else, my goodness, we have studies that we would show to you that I feel like if I showed these studies to somebody who was completely opposite to me, they would be like, wow, so the facts really determine your position. Yes. So it's not a club. I'm not in a political party club, and this is distant from my core concerns. I read books, I form my views, And the basis for my conviction is that I think this is the way the world really is.
Yeah, I do think that part of the reason some of the Christians, at least, who I've talked to, have thought that politics doesn't matter is because they do think of it as just different opinions. It's just a matter of opinion. You know, some people think this works, some people think that works. Why can't we just all get along? I'm sure this works sometimes and this works other times. Having studied public policy, I just saw in study after study after study that we're actually dealing with facts and we're dealing with things that are fairly predictable. You know, you enact this policy, you see this result, and the result is usually either, you know, some degree of human suffering or some degree of human thriving. And so that's why we care about this. It comes back to, again, God's image bearers and to the opportunity to continue being able to share the gospel. I mean, the difference, I'm sure you've heard before, the difference between North Korea and South Korea, which are on the same island, the same, peninsula, the same people group. They had the same language, the same resources and all of that. They were just divided basically in half. And communism was the way in the North and free market economy in the South. And what we see is that in the North Korea has probably the greatest degree of suffering and the least amount of freedom, probably even imaginable, for sharing the gospel, for sharing truth. And so these people are suffering now. They're going to suffer until something changes. And they are not being given the opportunity to hear the reason why they can have hope in the next life.
Well put.
Yeah, powerful example there. Wow, the time is flying. So before we go, I want you to help our listeners just to point online where they can find both the podcast and your respective websites or blogs. Of course, we'll link to these in the show notes, but where can we find those Knight and Rose?
I think probably the best thing to look at is my blog is winteryknight.com. WinteryKnight.com. There I post the show notes once a week for each episode of the podcast. And if you just want to subscribe to the podcast, we're everywhere. And the best place to find, your place to subscribe would be knightandrose.podbean.com. KNIGHTANDROSE.podbean.com. And we're also on YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey. We upload a version of the podcast as a video file there.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Desert Rose and Wintery Knight. We're looking forward to hearing more on the podcast, Knight and Rose Show. Listeners, check it out in the show notes. Thanks, guys, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast. We also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice. And please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.